in some ways, it was a very successful dinner party. At least with regard to the food. The vichyssoise was delicious, and the venison casserole was a triumph. The conversation flowed well enough, but, as per usual, it all went quiet when we tucked into the creme brulee. Have you noticed how a decent dessert requires absolute concentration? Anne had gone to the trouble of preparing a separate vegetarian main course for Sue, even if it was only vegetables on a bed of vegetables. Sue is Roger's new girlfriend. I've heard a lot about her, but it's the first time we've actually met. Anne and Roger and I, along with Anne's husband Colin, we were all at uni together, 25 centuries ago. Can you believe it? They say you form your most enduring friendships at uni or school. I think there's some truth in that. I've lost touch with all my old school friends, but fortunately I fell in with a good crowd when I went to uni. Of course, Colin was supposed to be there, but unfortunately he had to work late. Apparently his boss sets unreasonable deadlines and he's scared of losing his job. I suppose that would be a disaster with 5 mouths and a mortgage to feed. Come to think of it, if I were an employer, I'd only take on people with a family to support. Let's face it, they have far more to lose if they don't hold on to their jobs. And they'd be more likely to work unreasonable hours when the only other option is being at home with the kids. That would certainly explain why Colin's rarely home before the twins are in bed. So, it's all down to Anne. Anne was a classical musician before the twins were born. Really going places, practically a household name. She had to give it all up when she had the family, which is such a shame. She had such a natural talent. She's also a wonderful cook, but it's not often she gets to have guests for dinner these days, which is hardly surprising. The conversation was disrupted every 5 minutes, basically whenever the twins put in an appearance. Have you noticed how when children are around, they always have to be the centre of attention, and you can't even tell them to be quiet anymore? I think the Victorians had the right idea. Children should be seen and not heard. Mind you, I'd rather they were neither seen nor heard. I'm surprised Anne allows them to stay up so late. She can't have any time to herself. It turns out Sue's very keen to start a family, as she put it. So the conversation at the dinner table was all about bringing up children, which was frankly rather tedious. To spice things up a bit, I mentioned how there are parents out there who regret having children. Of course, I was looking at Anne. She doesn't like to admit it, even to herself, but it all comes out in rare moments of truthfulness, usually after a few drinks. You must have heard parents say, "Never have kids," implying they don't really mean it. But a part of them really does mean it. Sue kept going on and on about how children have special insights and we can learn a lot from them. Oh, for goodness sake, what stuff and nonsense! I think people search for something in children they feel they've lost in themselves. I can't remember a child ever saying anything remotely interesting or unexpected. Sue said spending time with children can be very rewarding. She must have a very high threshold of boredom. I can't understand how any intelligent person could possibly enjoy the company of children. I mean, would you want to spend time with an adult who had no experience of life? and to make matters worse was emotionally incontinent? I don't think so. To my mind, parents view their children through rose-tinted spectacles, and those of us who watch from the sidelines can't bring ourselves to contradict the illusion which is so fundamental to their lives. We're too polite to break the taboo. People describe children as innocent. What they really mean is they're naive and unsophisticated. Let's face it, they're far from innocent. They can be vicious, cruel, and totally without compassion. Look at the way they bully each other, always picking on the most vulnerable or the one that doesn't seem to fit in. To my mind, parents sentimentalise children. Take away the sentiment, you're left with nothing except for the desire to avoid them. I'm just saying, we should look at these things objectively, like the suffering of children. It's a tragedy when anyone experiences suffering. It doesn't matter how old they are. Have you noticed how paedophiles are the ultimate pariah? Of course they're deplorable, but newspapers make more of a fuss about the suffering of children than any other group in society, even the elderly, who are just as vulnerable. To my mind, the only people who should be allowed anywhere near children are those who don't like them. Anne said there are plenty of openings in children's television if ever I fancy a change of career. Can't imagine anything worse. I think Anne sees my freedom and independence as a deliberate challenge to her way of life, a denial of the value of all the sacrifices she's made. Well, she's made her own bed. When I told Sue that I deliberately chose to be child-free, she reacted as though I'm some kind of deviant. Of course, the usual term is childless, implying a lack of something. But we don't describe an operating theatre as germless. When we buy our cigarettes at the airport, we don't say dutyless. We don't say footloose and fancyless, do we? Anyway, Sue implied, because I don't want kids, that I'm in some way less feminine or less caring. Is it wrong to want a life that's not dominated by sleepless nights, pushchairs, dirty nappies, baby food, mumps, measles, vomit, gaudy plastic toys, school league tables and grumpy teenagers? Sue thinks I'm afraid of responsibility. I told her I wouldn't take responsibility for an aspidistra, let alone a child. I don't even want a dog or a cat. They'd only cramp my lifestyle. Not that I'm saying an aspidistra would necessarily cramp my lifestyle. And don't get me wrong, I love dogs and cats. I love all small sort of cuddly things, just as long as they're not human. Halfway through dinner, Charlotte woke up. So, naturally, Sue wanted to see her. Anne offered to bring her down. I said it really wouldn't be necessary. Of course, Sue had to hold the baby. Like the majority of infants, it's an ugly, scowling little thing with a wrinkled red face. It was all tightly wrapped in some sort of white sheet. I was reminded of the creature in Eraserhead, but I kept that thought to myself. After a while, Sue proffered the baby towards me, but I refused to take it. Roger was the next victim. Could tell he had no idea how to hold it. He made some comment about it being surprisingly heavy when compared with a dog or a cat of the same dimensions, that without fur, its volume to surface area ratio was so much higher. Needless to say, Sue wasn't happy with what I thought to be a perfectly reasonable scientific observation. To make matters worse, the baby had left some bodily fluid of some kind all down the front of his new blazer. It's not that I hate children. I don't have a strong emotional reaction of any kind. If they behave irritatingly, my response is one of irritation. If they don't, I'm merely indifferent. Doesn't go any deeper. I went to school with them, actually, although I must admit I couldn't stand the other children, even then. My attitude toward the majority of my schoolmates was one of disdain. I found them irritating, ignorant, and tedious. Mind you, I look back on my own childhood with acute embarrassment. I'm sure if I met myself as a child, I'd run a mile. Despite Roger's reaction to Charlotte, Sue said she thought he'd make a brilliant father. I asked her if that was what she saw in him. She didn't like that. But Roger's an old friend. I'm concerned for his happiness. I'm wondering if he's doing the right thing. He used to be just as opposed to having children as I am. He once told me he despaired of meeting a woman who was interested in him rather than his ability to procreate. Well, isn't that Sue in a nutshell? He once told me he'd become very adept at listening out for the faint sound of the ticking clock. He's not the only one. Over the years, I've spoken to several male friends, and not a single one of them expressed an independent desire to have children. But eventually, most of them fell under the spell of a woman with an obsession. Either they were blinded by passion, or they were too weak to stand up for themselves. From what Roger told me, when they first met, Sue wasn't even remotely attracted to him. She had him doing all these DIY jobs around her house. And when he finally told her how he felt about her, she said she saw him as a friend, not a lover. Someone she could rely on. It's not the first time Roger's been in that situation. Some women seem to enjoy these sort of unbalanced friendships, where the man wants more than she's prepared to give. I suppose they find it flattering. Anyway, she took advantage of his good nature for years before her maternal instinct kicked him with a vengeance, and all of a sudden she saw him as suitable relationship material. Suitable father material, more like. Well, I suppose he's her last chance. She's 40, if she's a day. I think Roger only agreed to have a child with Sue because he doesn't think he can do any better. I mean, let's face it, he's well past his prime. Sue said, there's nothing wrong with a woman being attracted to a man because of his paternal qualities. I mean, we've all seen the poster. The bare-chested young man holding the baby. The very image of the new man. Tailored to appeal to women's basic instincts of procreation and sex. Mind you, out of the various couples I know, most of the women lose all sexual interest in their partner after he's had their children. That's assuming there was any sexual interest in the first place. I suppose, underneath the thin veneer of civilization, we're all victims of our biology, or the vessels for our selfish genes. But I'd like to think we could be more than that. To my mind, a refusal to procreate is an expression of our humanity. I mean, it's hardly an achievement to bring a child into the world. It's no more than giving in to our animal instincts. Mind you, it takes a lot more than instinct to bring up a child well, and very few parents seem to get it right. Mine did their best, but they were always trying to impose their values on us. Like most parents, they wanted us to be normal, to be conventional, to fit in. My entire childhood was blighted by this constant battle between the pressure to conform and my desire to live my life under my own terms. It was exactly the same for my brother. They were far too concerned with the opinion of others. They seemed scared that other people would discover our family's dirty secrets. My brother's sexuality, for example, or the fact that my father was conceived outside wedlock, or more important things, such as the washing up wasn't always done immediately after dinner, or the fact that a bottle of milk was placed on the dining table. What would the neighbours think? And at the top of their list of conventional values was the importance of getting married and having children. The only couples they knew who didn't have children were to be pitied. If they'd actually chosen to be child-free, they were regarded as irredeemably selfish. And if they'd wanted to have children but couldn't have them for whatever reason, it was expected that after a few years they'd become precious and selfish, prickly, pernickety characters, not given to compromise, not rounded by the school of hard knocks that comes with bringing up children, which is plainly absurd. Some of the most difficult and uncompromising people I know are parents. Mind you, their children are pretty screwed up. I've heard things have changed since we were children, but I think parents nowadays pander to their children too much. They become insolent and work shy, with a sense of entitlement bordering on narcissism. They're always going on about respect, but they do nothing to earn it. They have a conceit and a self-confidence that comes from never having been told they're in the wrong, combined with a remarkable ignorance of anything outside their shallow preoccupations. They're arrogant, but with nothing to be arrogant about. Sue wanted to know what was really behind my objection to starting a family. Why does there have to be something behind it? A more appropriate question would be, why would anyone want to have kids? Quite apart from anything else, I find the whole process of pregnancy and childbirth physically abhorrent. It's like something out of that film, Alien, having a parasite growing inside me, distending my stomach and causing agonising pain when it finally emerges into the outside world. The only difference is that the parasitic relationship continues for the next 20-odd years. I appreciate my choice is a selfish one, but I don't feel guilty about it. I just feel liberated. The reasons for wanting children can be just as selfish, like having someone to look after you in your old age or having your family round your deathbed. Frankly, I'd sooner live like a queen and die like a dog rather than the other way round. Anne once asked me to look after her twins for the day. A whole day. 5 minutes in their company gives me a headache. She wanted me to take them to Blackpool. I refused, of course. I can't imagine anything worse than taking kids on a day out. You're every moment desperately searching for ways to keep the little blighters entertained. Perish the thought they might experience a nanosecond's boredom. And the moaning and the griping at the slightest inconvenience. And they're so acquisitive. I want this, I want that. Anyway, just bringing children into this overpopulated world is a selfish act, if you ask me. Do would-be parents consider diminishing resources or damage to the environment? People should be rewarded for not having children, but it's usually the other way round. Mind you, the reasons for wanting children can be selfish, but you have to be pretty unselfish once you've got them. Look at what Helen told Graham when she became pregnant. She said that from now on, all his hobbies and passions would cease, and henceforth his every waking moment would be devoted to providing for her and the baby to the exclusion of everything else. I'm not exaggerating. According to Graham, that's actually what she said. Their marriage didn't last long, which is hardly surprising. The only difference between Helen and most other mothers is that she was unwise to express the truth of the situation. There's a lot that goes unspoken between couples, but sometimes it's good to hear a few home truths, rather than be in a relationship based on false premises or incompatible agendas. Let's face it, most men and women have completely different agendas. Men want women for sex and companionship. Women want men to sire their children and provide for them. In other words, men want to make love, women want to make babies. That would certainly describe the situation between Roger and Sue. Sue kept going on and on about starting a family. I despise that phrase. It's so self-important. Are families such a wonderful thing? More often than not, they can be full of resentment, jealousy, petty squabbles, power struggles, and emotional blackmail. To my mind, the nuclear family is little more than an incubator for all our character flaws and personality disorders. I sometimes wish I'd been brought up on a kibbutz. Have you noticed how politicians churn out these phrases? Hard-working families, families up and down the country, and the worst one, family values. That's just another term for social conservatism, and we all know where that leads. They think they'll win votes by glorifying the family, but it's just discrimination, pure and simple. Well, what about the single and the child-free? Don't we count? They create the impression that if you don't have children, you somehow have less value to society. I think they have an ulterior motive in promoting the family. They know people are more likely to toe the line if they have a family to support. They see the single and the child-free as loose cannons, untethered, and somehow dangerous to society. It's exactly the same with organised religions. They know full well that children born into a stable family are more likely to follow the religion of their parents, and they prohibit any form of sexual activity that doesn't increase the size of their flock. Come to think of it, flock's an appropriate term in this case. It turns out Roger and Sue are on their 6th attempt at IVF, the first 3 at the taxpayer's expense. I asked them if they thought it was good use of NHS resources. Sue didn't like that. She said having a baby's a human right, which is plainly absurd. Have you noticed how IVF turns the desire to have a child into an obsession. I've seen families destroyed by the stress of it all. First the hoping, and then the disappointment. Between you and me, I think Roger's secretly hoping the IVF won't actually work. He's in a relationship with a woman who desperately wants to have a child, and he's paying a fortune to make it happen, but I think, in his heart, he hopes it'll fail. That's my guess. But if it does fail, will Sue stick around? Perhaps he's hoping she'll grow to love him for himself. But I think he's on a hiding to nothing. I implied as much over dinner. What I actually said was, I don't go into a relationship because I need something from it. All I want is the pleasure of someone's company and the passion. Isn't that purpose enough? Sue didn't like that. She only has one purpose. She pointed out how in films and novels a couple having a baby is seen as the ultimate happy ending. She's right, of course, but to my mind, that's little more than a lazy and narrow-minded cliché. I tend to avoid dramas about families. They're only interesting if the family is highly dysfunctional, like real families. I hit the fast-forward button whenever children appear on the screen. On the train, only the other day, I couldn't read my book because a little girl was subjecting her mother to a barrage of inane questions that lasted the entire journey. I tried not to listen, but it was impossible to ignore the high, piercing voice. Why do children have such high-pitched voices? I suppose it's something to do with natural selection, but it's a serious nuisance. The mother was clearly exasperated, but she was patiently answering every question, much to the annoyance of everyone else. And some of her answers were incorrect or misleading. I felt like correcting her on a number of occasions. They should have child-free carriages on trains, and child-free days at museums and galleries and restaurants, or at least child-free periods, especially in pubs. Happy hours, in other words. What I resent is the self-righteous attitude of people who expect you to tolerate their kids' behaviour. These parents brand me as selfish, but what about their lack of consideration for anyone outside their little family's bubble of selfishness? I'm always disappointed when a close friend has a child. Anne's certainly not the woman she was. What happened to the vivacious, joyful Anne? What happened to her inquiring mind, her independent spirit? What happened to her love of the arts and her passion for travel to exotic places? The best she can do nowadays is Legoland or Harry Potter World. Now she's no more than a carbon copy mother, preoccupied with the mundane demands of parenthood and permanently exhausted. Anne has no idea how to deal with her twins. Every strategy she adopts always seems to backfire. She never has a moment's peace. They're so uncooperative about absolutely everything. They're greedy, ungrateful and disruptive. It's as if they're deliberately malicious. It's really getting her down. She tells me she feels trapped. If ever I'd had the slightest urge to have kids, I'd only have to look at Anne. At least she recognises what she's missing. When most people have children, they lose sight of all alternative values. For example, Tanya was another of our university circle. I've hardly seen her since she had the baby. Once I asked her if I could see her on her own without the baby, but she took it as a personal insult. Apparently, they're inseparable. They come as a pair, or not at all. When Tanya was younger, she was dead against having children, but when I reminded her of that, she completely denied it. It's as if her memory's been wiped, some sort of self-inflicted brainwashing. She certainly changed. She used to be such an independent woman, feisty, strong and assertive. Now she just seems so needy, so desperate for her child's unwavering affection. I think she's had a crisis of identity. I suppose being a parent gave her a purpose, a role in life. She used to fancy herself as a photographer. She'd email me these really interesting pics, really creative. Now, all I get are photos of her kid. And you should see the Christmas cards. The kid on the front, grinning inanely, and inside she goes on and on about her school grades and stuff. Why do parents think you're interested in their kids? It's like those signs in the back windows of cars, baby on board. I mean, what are these parents trying to say? I think it's a case of, look at me, I'm really fertile and I've contributed to society by bringing a child into the world, unlike some sad childless bastard you can drive into with impunity. To my mind, people fall into two camps, those with children and those without, and ne'er the twain shall meet. You see, I didn't want to lose yet another old friend, and I could very easily see Roger going the same way as Tanya. I thought that by exposing a few home truths, I was doing him a favour, but it all rather seems to have backfired. Apparently Sue was so offended by my comments that she told Roger if he valued their relationship, he'd have nothing more to do with yours truly. They left the dinner party immediately after scoffing down the creme brulee, leaving Anne very disappointed after all the trouble she'd been to. They didn't even stay for coffee. Then I received an email from Roger saying that I'd put him in a position where he'd had to choose between his relationship with Sue and his friendship with me, and that was a no-brainer after the way I'd behaved. To make matters worse, even Anne sided with Sue. She said I'd spoilt the evening, soured the atmosphere with my comments, and it'd be the last time she'd be inviting me to a dinner party. She said she was seriously questioning the basis of our friendship, which is such a shame. Still, every cloud has a silvery lining. At least it's the last time I'll have to put up with her kids.